WJLA 24/7 News. Good Morning Washington. On your side.
Well, born in St. Louis, Missouri, the father of rock and roll, Chuck Berry, was the inspiration for groups like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. Berry had a number of comeback recordings, and in 1972 had the first and the only #1 pop chart hit of his career with My Ding-a-Ling. Now, today marks the second anniversary of his death, and author Stephanie Bennett is here to talk about her book, Johnny B. Bad, the inside story of the man and his music. Well, welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you.
So we were talking a little during the break. You have made a number of movies in your lifetime serving as producer, mostly with rock stars.
Yes.
How did making this particular movie back in the mid-'80s rank in terms of difficulty?
I would say it was the most difficult. It was, to me, it was like a feather in my cap to get Chuck Berry to agree to do a film.
Mm-hmm.
He had never agreed to be filmed before. I mean, he did tiny interviews, he did performances on Shindig and those kind of shows, and Ed Sullivan. But to actually do an interview, be followed around in his home, he had never agreed to that.
Because he was a very private person,
Very
right?
private person, yes.
So you were working with Universal at the time?
Universal financed it, and Taylor Hackford was the director. And Keith Richards was the musical director. So it was a great team of people.
Right, and so many people would say that Chuck Berry, of course, he did so much through so many different generations to bridge the racial gap. Of course, we're seeing some video of him right there. Songs like Rock and Roll, Back in the USA, Maybelline, Johnny B. Good, along with that crazy duck walk that he did across the stage. So many of us remember it as a positive. Of course, one of the reasons that Keith Richards wanted to do this movie too is to remember the man. Okay, so what was your role on the film?
I was the producer. I was the one that made the deal with Chuck, which turned out to be not a deal because he changed the deal every day of the production. And I also made the deal with Universal, with Taylor Hackford, and Keith Richards. So I was responsible for everything, really.
How long did it take to make the movie?
It was over a period of about 1.5 to 2 years, because there was a lot of... Keith and Chuck had met many years before when Keith got up on the stage and Chuck hit him and gave him a black eye because he thought it was a fan. And they hadn't seen each other. And also, nobody had really heard Chuck recently, so we went to Chicago to just see him perform at a blues festival. And Keith actually got on stage and performed with him. But I think something was very revealing in that day. Helen Mirren said, we got into a car afterwards to be driven away, and of course surrounded by fans, and it had, you could see through the windows. But people were not calling Keith, Keith. They were calling Chuck, Chuck. They were saying, Keith, Keith. And I think that he knew that part of him is like, the Stones, yes, he got the money for the publishing, but he never got the recognition. He never really was the star like Keith Richards or Mick Jagger or the Beatles.
So Chuck Berry passed away 2 years ago, to the date?
To the day.
To the day. To the day. So your book has to do with the frustrations, the setbacks in making this film. Talk about some of the more outrageous moments during that 1.5 to 2 years of making the movie.
Well, I guess the first one was a scout to Algoa prison. Chuck was in Algoa prison for 3 years as a young man. And he told Taylor Hackford, yes, you can come and film me at the prison. But first, of course, Taylor, being a big feature film director, wanted to see the place and take a look. So we got into Chuck's Cadillac. He always drove a Cadillac. And he drove us straight into the prison, into the courtyard, where the prisoners were having their, I guess, daily, exercise. And suddenly, he jumps out of the car, Taylor jumps out of the car. There's 4 women, and suddenly, just as they noticed us, we noticed them. And they chased after us, and we have no idea where to go. We were in a sort of a quadrangle. And finally, some guards came out, and they had us on the ground. They had one woman's, I mean, it was unbelievable.
So you feared for the safety, perhaps, of your life?
Yes, it was terrifying.
What would you do different knowing what you know today? Because, again, this was back in the 80s. What would you do different real quick as we get ready to wrap?
Okay. I don't know. I'm glad I made the film. I think that the fact is that without Chuck, there would be no rock and roll music. John Lennon said that. He was, if you're going to call rock and roll another name, it would be Chuck Berry. I think that the film, how could I make a book? Because there was so much to talk about. So much happened.
Right.
So buy the book. It'll fascinate you, and it tells you a lot about Chuck too.
Stephanie Bennett, the book, JohnnyBBadBook.com for finding out more there. Thank you so very much for sharing your story.